Have you ever wondered who really owns a person's name after they're gone? Today, you'll know how Steve Ross stepped forward to expose the truth behind his father's famous legacy. Bob Ross's son finally speaks up.
So I lived there most of my life, and when I was 16, my parents split up, and my mom and I moved to Indianapolis.
Before Dad died, he had said, "You must continue." That was his last words, to me.
Steve says his father amended his will to leave his name, image, and creative rights to him. Yet, those rights were taken over by the business partners anyway. He claims that behind the scenes, his father was pressured, his company took control, and his own future was sidelined. Let's get into the details.
Thought today we'd do one of these almighty black canvases. It's time we got into doing something on a black canvas. I'd like to show you how you can do it.
The hidden struggle behind the smile. Long before his passing, Bob Ross had already become a beloved figure. His calm voice, iconic hairstyle, and cheerful little trees welcomed millions of viewers into his world.
Hi, welcome back. Certainly glad you could join us today because today is a very special day. Every once in a while when we get him off the road from teaching classes, I bring my son Steve in here to let him give you a demonstration. Steve's been painting since he was about 12 years old, and I think you'll find he's absolutely fantastic. Steve, welcome to the show today.
Thanks, Dad.
Tell you what, I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and I'll see you later. Son, do a nice painting for everyone.
But behind what seemed like perfect tranquility lay deeper troubles. Many years later, his son Steve Ross chose to speak out and share what had been kept quiet for decades. Only a few people know that when Bob's health began to fail, a new chapter in his story opened, one that few of his fans knew about.
Interesting things that we see as we run across the country teaching this fantastic method is people continually say, "I can't draw a straight line. I don't have the talent, Bob, to do what you're doing." That's baloney. Talent is a pursued interest. In other words, anything that you're willing to practice, you can do.
Suddenly, the legacy of the painter seemed less about color and joy and more about control and rights. The company he had helped build, Bob Ross Incorporated, became the center of a bitter dispute. At the heart of the matter were his longtime business partners, Annette Kowalski and Walt Kowalski, who had supported Bob's rise and now aimed for full control. The trouble really began when Bob's second wife, Jane Ross, died of cancer in 1992. Her death altered the structure of the business and shifted the balance of power. Ownership was transferred in a way that gave the Kowalskis greater influence, sowing the seeds of a conflict with lasting impact. As Bob's condition worsened, the pressure mounted. The Kowalskis asked Bob to give up his remaining shares in the company. Even though Bob was not strong physically, he resisted the demand. A relationship that once seemed friendly and collaborative started to fracture. The partners engaged in harsh disagreements and legal threats during the final months of Bob's life. Extended timeline and legal impacts. Shortly before his passing in July 1995, Bob Ross made an effort to protect his creative legacy. In 1994, he created the Bob Ross Trust, which attempted to assign the rights to his name, image, and creative works to his son, Steve Ross, and his half-brother, Jimmy L. Cox. The split gave Jimmy Cox 51% and Steve 49% of the interest. After Bob's death, his business partners Annette Kowalski and Walt Kowalski, who co-founded Bob Ross, Incorn BRI, moved to gain full control of the company and its rights. They sued the estate and secured a settlement in 1997 in which the estate and the trust conveyed all rights to the Kowalskis' business interest. Years later, in 2017, Steve Ross filed a lawsuit against Bob Ross, Inc. and the Kowalskis, claiming that the trust had granted him all rights to his father's name and likeness. By 2019, a U.S. federal court ruled against him, explaining that the trust did not own the rights to assign because Bob had signed agreements during his lifetime that transferred those rights to BRI. Because of this ruling, Steve Ross did not receive the financial benefit from the growing Bob Ross brand, despite his father's intentions. Meanwhile, The Bob Ross brand continued to increase in value, driven by streaming, licensing, and merchandise. A long-hidden battle comes to light. For many years, the legal struggle over Bob Ross's legacy remained largely out of public view, while his business partners, Annette Kowalski and Walt Kowalski, tightened their control over the company bearing his name. His son, Steve Ross, was gradually pushed aside. His attempts to claim his rightful place in his father's empire were blocked at every turn. Yet, despite mounting legal defeats and personal costs, Steve held on to a steadfast goal: to honor his father's memory and ensure his true wishes were fulfilled. Then, in 2021, more than 3 decades after Bob Ross's untimely passing, Steve gained the chance to share his story with the world. In the Netflix documentary, Bob Ross: Happy Accidents, Betrayal, and Greed, he opened up about the bitter battle that had consumed much of his life. The film used interviews and previously unreleased footage to show a son's unwavering dedication to his father's legacy and the steep cost he paid for loyalty. As the documentary reached wider audiences, it forced fans to grapple with a reality beneath the painter's gentle public image. Viewers who grew up watching his calming tutorials now learned of corporate struggles and family disputes that shadowed his final years. For many, the discovery that the man they admired had been betrayed by people closest to him was a hard truth to accept. For Steve, the film represented a long overdue chance to set the record straight. He spoke candidly about his father's intentions, the amendments made to his will, and the relentless efforts by the Kowalskis to seize control of the company. Through this transparency, he invited a new understanding of what it means to protect an artist's legacy. Behind the corporate doors. In 1985, the company bearing Bob Ross's name, BRI, was founded by Bob, his wife Jane, and the business partners Annette Kowalski and Walt Kowalski. From the start, Bob focused on teaching and painting, while the Kowalskis handled much of the business side. Over time, Bob's public image became the engine of the brand. Due to this division of roles, Bob's creative and personal identity were deeply tied to the corporation's assets. The business registered trademarks and licensing deals under Bob's name, likeness, and voice. At the same time, Bob remained a minority shareholder after Jane's death, as corporate rules required that her shares be transferred to the surviving 3 partners. This structure created a mismatch. Bob's name and image were central, yet the business arrangement granted him less control. Over time, this gap widened and became one of the roots of the later conflict. One subtle but crucial point is how the rights to Bob Ross's name, image, voice, and likeness were handled. Although Bob later created a trust to pass these rights to his son, Steve, and half-brother, Jimmy Cox, the court found that Bob had already signed away or transferred many of the rights during his lifetime. In other words, even though the trust seemed to hand over rights, those rights were no longer fully his to give. The legal doctrine held that you cannot transfer what you do not own. Because Bob's earlier contracts had effectively transferred the rights to the company, his trust did not have the power to transfer them to Steve. This distinction may appear technical, but it proved decisive in court. It underscores the need for estate planning, business contracting, and intellectual property law to align. Bob's case shows what can happen when they don't. Brand resurgence and commercial growth. After Bob's death, the brand built on his persona kept growing, but that growth mostly benefited the company controlled by the Kowalskis and their daughter. For instance, the company reemerged in new formats: streaming of Bob's show, merchandise such as brush sets and paint kits, and broader licensing into apparel and collectibles. Because the company held the legal rights, it was positioned to benefit from the brand's revival, even while Bob's son was legally blocked from leveraging the name in the same way. This created a further gap between the legacy Bob probably intended and the legacy his heirs were able to realize. A further dimension is the length of time this dispute stretched. The legal and business struggles did not resolve quickly. Steve did not learn about certain changes to his father's trust until decades later. This delay meant that by the time legal action was pursued, the brand had grown enormously, the company had solidified its position, and the financial stakes had ballooned. Yet Steve's claim was hampered not only by legal rulings, but also by the practical difficulty of reconciling decades of brand usage, licensing, and evolution. In addition, the shifting nature of media, streaming services, and global merchandise meant that Bob Ross, Inc. operated in a very different economic environment than when Bob first signed his contracts. This shift increased the complexity of assessing rights, value, and control. For those who do not know much about Bob Ross's life, let's learn some facts about him. Early life and military service. Bob Ross was born Robert Norman Ross on October 29, 1942, in Daytona Beach, Florida. He grew up working alongside his father, a carpenter, and preferred being in his father's workshop to being in a classroom. When he reached 9th grade, Bob decided to leave school and work as his father's apprentice instead. At the age of 18, Bob enlisted in the United States Air Force. He served for about 20 years, and much of his service took place in Alaska. There, he worked as a drill sergeant, a role that required him to be strict with recruits and enforce discipline. This role conflicted with his natural disposition. He did not enjoy being the person who yelled or made recruits feel afraid. He longed for a more peaceful, creative outlet. While stationed in Alaska, Bob began to explore painting. He attended classes, and he eventually learned a method called wet on wet. This technique allowed him to apply new layers of oil paint before the earlier layers were dry, making the painting process faster. With practice and persistence, Bob mastered this technique and developed the skill to complete beautiful landscapes in under 30 minutes. This skill would become the foundation for his later career as a television instructor and beloved painter. The rise of a painting phenomenon. A pivotal opportunity arrived that would reshape the course of his life. On January 11, 1983, the show The Joy of Painting premiered on public television. Bob Ross stood before a blank canvas, transforming it into vivid landscapes while speaking in a calm, encouraging voice, inviting viewers of all ages to pick up a brush and join him. During each episode, he guided the audience through mountains, streams, winter scenes, and cabins. He made painting feel welcoming and fun by using simple tools and friendly explanations. His approachable manner and belief that anyone could paint turned what might have seemed like a complex hobby into something inviting. Even as his fame grew, Bob kept his feet on the ground. Outside the studio, he found joy in caring for injured animals. Deer, squirrels, foxes, and owls became his companions. This compassion mirrored the gentle nature he shared on screen. At the same time, his influence spread beyond television. He introduced a set of art supplies bearing his name: brushes, paints, easels, and other tools for budding artists. Through these tools, he allowed his fans to follow his style and begin their own creative journeys. By the mid-90s, the business behind his name had grown remarkably. What began as simple art instruction evolved into a full-fledged enterprise, demonstrating how a humble start can lead to lasting cultural impact. Bob Ross's journey from apprentice to cultural icon stands as proof of that transformation. His son, Steve Ross, later reflected on his father's public persona versus his real-life presence. While viewers heard a gentle whisper on screen, Steve recalled that Bob's everyday voice carried more weight than people might assume. End of the road for a creative life. As his show reached ever more homes and his fame spread far and wide, Bob Ross began to face serious health difficulties that would challenge even his upbeat outlook. In those years, the painter who seemed full of energy and joy found himself dealing with illness after illness, each one harder than the last. First came two heart attacks in the early 1990s, brought on by years of heavy smoking and the constant push of working long hours in front of a camera. Far from slowing him down, those early attacks seemed to fuel Bob's determination to continue painting and teaching. He kept going even when most people in his situation would have stopped. But then in 1994 came the major blow. Bob was diagnosed with lymphoma, a rare and aggressive type of cancer. The diagnosis shook his fans, who had come to believe in the cheerful, tireless painter who encouraged everyone to create happy little trees. Despite the grim edges of his own reality, Bob remained committed to his craft. He showed up in the studio, paintbrush in hand, determined to finish each episode of his show with the same warmth and enthusiasm as before. Over time, the decline became visible. Viewers who watched the final airing of the 31st season of his show might have noticed that Bob's sparkle was dimming. The perm that had become part of his signature look was thinning. His voice, once smooth and confident, had lost some strength. He appeared more fragile, fewer words coming easily as his energy drained. But despite that, his kindness did not vanish. The same genuine encouragement and gentle tone that had welcomed thousands into painting remained. He kept showing up for his audience, even when his own body weighed him down. By the time his health insisted on more rest, Bob chose to leave the studio and retreat to his estate in Florida. There, his work slowed, yet the spirit that had guided his career never faded. On July 4th, 1995, Bob Ross passed away at the age of 52. His life had been cut short, but his mission to bring art to everyone had endured every setback. As his health began to falter, Bob Ross sensed that his time might be shorter than many expected. He took action to secure the future of his work and the company he had built. He structured his business, Bob Ross Incorporated, arranged for his name and creative output, and set up his estate to protect his legacy for generations. However, the plans he put in place to preserve his vision also laid the groundwork for a serious dispute. The legal agreements he signed, the business partnerships he formed, and the trust he created for his intellectual property all intersected in ways that would later produce conflict among those closest to him. His intentions to safeguard his work became entwined with the corporate structure and his personal relationships. As Bob's condition worsened, he withdrew from the public eye and retreated to his estate in Orlando, Florida. He no longer had the energy to paint for long hours in his studio in Muncie, Indiana, and he sometimes found a brush too heavy to hold. On July 4th, 1995, surrounded by a small circle of family and friends, he took his final breath at just 52 years old. Though his passing marked the end of a beloved life devoted to art and teaching, it also triggered the beginning of a new chapter, one marked not by color and canvas, but by courtrooms and control. The man who encouraged creativity and peace became at the center of a legacy struggle that threatened to overshadow his gentle message. Bob may have created happy little trees, but the aftermath of his life produced deeply unhappy legal trees with tangled branches. The very structure he built to honor his work became the soil from which conflict grew. And that conflict would bleed into his family, his company, and the memory of the man who taught millions to pick up a brush and believe in themselves. Steve Ross grew up in the shadow of one of painting's best-known figures. From a young age, he watched his father pick up a brush and turn blank canvases into serene scenes of mountains, lakes, and happy little trees. He inherited a love for painting and nature, and he also felt the weight of a name many people recognized long before they knew his face. As he moved into adulthood, Steve carried both that legacy and the challenges that came with it. For many years after Bob Ross's passing, Steve stayed largely out of the spotlight. He had to work through grief and identity at the same time. Because his father's name had become so closely associated with a brand, Steve found himself in a position where he wanted to honor his father's legacy while forging his own path. He understood painting, the brush, the oils, and the technique, but he also carried the emotional burden of living in someone's huge, artistic shadow. When the legal battles over his father's company and rights began to surface, Steve was drawn into the conflict. He saw that his father's name and likeness had commercial value, far beyond what many fans realized. As the company behind Bob Ross's brand gained momentum, Steve found that his efforts to step in and contribute in his own way were being blocked. He tried to claim a place, but found the lines between personal intent, business contracts, and legacy much more complicated than he had expected. That struggle shaped much of Steve's life in the years that followed. He faced disappointment as business decisions, legal rulings, and corporate structures limited his access to the very name he grew up with. At the same time, he held on to the belief that his father's true wish was simply to teach, to inspire creativity, and to spread joy, not to create a fortress of rights and money. That belief kept Steve going through the dark times. As we know, no pain, no gain. Eventually, Steve returned to painting and teaching in his own way. He began holding workshops, sharing the wet-on-wet techniques his father taught, and inviting new generations to give painting a try. While he couldn't necessarily use his father's name or brand in the same way others did, he found a way to use his skills and love of art to connect with people, share calm moments, and carry forward the spirit of accessibility his dad believed in. In doing this, Steve also invited people to think about what it means to have a legacy. A legacy is more than a name on a product. It's also about meaning, intention, and the people who carry on the work. For Steve, the real legacy his father left behind was not just the paintbrush scenes, but the idea that art is for everyone and that each person has the capacity to create something beautiful. Steve's journey shows that preserving a legacy can be messy. It may involve sorting through agreements, emotions, business, and identity. Thanks so much for watching. If you were given the brush and the name of someone you admired, would you use it to honor their legacy exactly, or reshape it into something new? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and ring the bell so you won't miss what comes next.